In this lecture, we're going to talk about Theodore Roosevelt and the Progressive Era. The Progressive Era is a period of American history that we might date from perhaps the waning years of the 1890s up through about the end of World War I in 1918. It was a period that we associate with certain changes in American life. First, we begin to see an increased role for the federal government and an increase in the number of public intellectuals who propounded a philosophical defense of that increased role for government. Also, there's an increased role for the central government in particular. There's an emphasis on the federal government as opposed to any lesser entities as being the proper locus of the people's allegiance and attention. We see the beginnings of the modern regulatory apparatus coming into play during the Progressive Era, which was very much in line with the progressive notion that it's better for society to be run by experts, so-called experts, and the more these experts can be insulated from the pressures of public opinion, the better. So we need a kind of a technocratic elite running society. Individualism and laissez-faire are increasingly going to be denigrated and dismissed and ridiculed as being outdated and unscientific, and that to the contrary, we need experts who will directly manage and coordinate our lives and the proper functioning of society. These ideas were very much embodied in the New Republic magazine, and a guy named Charles Forcey, F-O-R-C-E-Y, wrote a very good book about the New Republic and the social philosophy and political philosophy behind it, called The Crossroads of Liberalism, which I very much recommend to get a sense of what these progressive ideas were and progressive thinkers were thinking. It's worth noting, as you'll see in one of the pieces that I'm assigning to you for your consideration, that the overwhelming majority of progressives supported U.S. intervention into World War I. I'll be noting that again. But overwhelmingly, the non-socialist left was in favor of U.S. intervention for various reasons, but one very significant reason, and a reason that was repeated by writers of the New Republic, was that a great enterprise like a world war would give the federal government the opportunity to begin directly planning the U.S. economy, and that people would be moved away from their superstitious reverence for private property and individual rights, and they will be brought more into this, what was understood to be this more modern way of looking at things, whereby we should think in terms of shared goods and shared sacrifices and the central direction of society as a replacement for the backward kind of Neanderthal attachment to individualism and laissez-faire. So that's why the John Deweys of the world and others were all in favor of U.S. government involvement in World War I. They understood that, of course, as the Founding Fathers said, war is about the least conservative thing in the world there is, for various reasons. And one of those reasons is that on the home front, it increases the power of government always and everywhere, and it always creates precedents that governments will then exploit in the future so that their power continues to grow over time. So they were all in favor of World War I, and the piece I've got you reading in particular is the absolutely outstanding piece by Murray Rothbard on the progressives and World War I, as World War I really being the culmination of, rather than the repudiation of, the progressive vision. Now it's interesting, when we hear about the so-called muckraking tradition during the Progressive Era, and by muckraking we mean the tradition whereby journalists would expose various scandals in the private sector or in local or city governments. When we encounter this, it's interesting to note that in keeping with the Progressive Era bias in favor of the idea that the federal government is your friend, the federal government is the great crusader against injustices, the muckrakers are not really going after federal government misdeeds, of which there were enough perhaps to focus on. But to the contrary, they would focus on this company or that company or this municipal government. But what the federal government was up to was not really of particular interest. Well, no surprise. That's precisely what the Progressive Era was all about, was the idea of denigrating all these other non-federal government institutions and suggesting that the solution to all these problems we see that derive from power being badly exercised at the local level is to concentrate power in one power source at the center, namely the federal government, and all this concentration of power will make sure there's no abuse of power at other levels. Now, what about that central authority? What if it exercises its power in an objectionable way? Well, that wasn't something we saw really from the muckrakers. It's interesting to note that Lincoln Steffens, whom I'll refer to again in another lecture, Lincoln Steffens wrote a book called The Shame of the Cities, talking about corruption at the city government level. But here's a guy who can have a magnifying glass on city government corruption, which I'm all in favor of magnifying glasses on city government corruption. But he makes a trip to post-Bolshevik Revolution Russia and reports back that it's a wonderful example of planning, and this is what the future is going to be like, and it's working fantastically. So you begin to wonder about how good these muckrakers are at seeing the big picture and really being able to perceive obvious and grotesque examples of outrages and enormities right in front of them. I am also assigning to you a little article about Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle, which was a fictional account of the Chicago meatpacking industry, which he intended to write as a way of talking about the terrible conditions under which the workers had to labor. But it turns out that his fictional account disgusted people more in terms of how the meat was being produced. And so he said, I meant to hit Americans in their hearts, and I accidentally hit them in their stomachs. But in this article that I'm assigning, the author gives you a little bit more background on that incident and whether it really is, whether the traditional story is in fact accurate. What often happened with the regulatory agencies that were created during the Progressive Era is that the business interests themselves believed that this was the best way to sort of stabilize competition and freeze in place existing firms, make it more difficult for upstart firms to get a hearing and to gain market share. And yet again, I'm referring you to some sources that talk about this, that the Progressive Era is more interesting in fact than the cartoonish version, the comic book version that we read, whereby these innocent, dispassionate crusaders for justice are just innocently pursuing the common good, and they're slapping down big business. And as usual, it's never really like that. Now, we also see, which again is very much in line with the overall ethos of the Progressive Era, is the development of a tradition within the Christian world, and really largely within the Protestant world, called the social gospel. One of the key thinkers in the social gospel tradition and most prolific thinkers was Walter Rauschenbusch. And when you read these books being written in the late 1890s, early 1900s, what you see is there's an emphasis on kind of transforming Christianity into a non-dogmatic system. I mean, rather than a system based on creeds and allegiances to various creeds, there's instead an emphasis on taking traditional Christian concepts and categories and redefining them in the service of the progressive project. There's an increased emphasis on social sin, as opposed to the traditional Christian emphasis on individual sin. Only individuals can commit sins. Well, now we get emphasis on sinful social structures, and the suggestion that salvation should not be thought of in some strictly otherworldly sense, but that we ought to think of a this-worldly sense in which salvation is a useful concept. And that what the social gospel thinkers often mean is that when we bring about a just society from a material point of view and a regulatory point of view, then we will have achieved a kind of salvation. So there's a kind of we might call a horizontalizing of Christian religious commitment that's being made by the social gospel. And of course, this fits directly into the progressive emphasis on federal regulatory agencies, on looking to the federal government to solve social ills, on having the federal government be the primary locus of people's allegiance. That's all basically following from the social gospel. But what we need to really emphasize, though, is what's happening in terms of the structure of the U.S. government. And we're going to see that the presidency, the office of president, is going to grow very dramatically during this time. And again, that fits in with this basic idea that the president will embody the will of the people. He represents everybody. He's going to be sure that the demands of the people are satisfied, that justice prevails, that private malefactors are kept in check by the crusaders for justice in the so-called public sector. It's interesting to note what Woodrow Wilson said about the potential of the presidential office. Woodrow Wilson, of course, would be elected president in 1912 and again in 1916, having served as governor of New Jersey and president of Princeton University. In his book, Constitutional Government in the United States, Wilson said as follows: "Let him once win the admiration and confidence of the country, and no other single force can withstand him. No combination of forces will easily overpower him. If he rightly interpret the national thought and boldly insist upon it, he is irresistible, and the country never feels the zest of action so much as when its president is of such insight and caliber." The presidential office, Wilson went on to say, is anything he has the sagacity and insight to make it. So there's this emphasis on the presidency as being a very malleable office, just waiting for an occupant to get hold of it who intends to really make the most out of it. So gone, all gone, will be the humble concept of the presidency in which its occupant simply seeks to execute the laws. No, to the contrary, we will now be subjected to presidents who have great visions for us, domestic and foreign, and want to lead us and engage in wide-ranging leadership. And I just wrote a little something about this, if I may note parenthetically, that the whole emphasis on leading, and gosh, I'd like to vote for that guy because I think he can lead. There is a warped theory of society at the heart of all this, because the spontaneous order in which you and I interact with each other and engage in peaceful cooperation through buying and selling and actions of that sort, this sort of thing does not require leadership. It just requires society to go about its business. And we have, I think, been almost brainwashed into thinking that there's some role for somebody leading in this situation. We should instead, it seems to me, if I may continue in this editorial line for just a moment, we ought to go about our business, contribute to society through the work we do, and not think that our lives are somehow not fulfilled unless we're being led by the paternal custodianship of some megalomaniac. But all the same, let's carry on. Let's get to the focus of our lecture today, and that's Theodore Roosevelt, who really embodies the spirit of the progressive era. And I want to share with you first what historian Arthur Eckertz had to say about Roosevelt. He said, quote, "He had only the greatest scorn for the kind of middle-class individualism and liberalism, of course in the classical sense, not the Hillary Clinton sense, that emphasized minding one's own business both at home and abroad." And that indeed was the classical liberal tradition. Classical liberal, of course, means free trade, free markets, peace, civil liberties, the kind of tradition to which Thomas Jefferson belonged, and to which Frederick Bastiat, some of the great 19th century thinkers belong. That's what Roosevelt is really a reaction against. H.L. Mencken, the great social critic, said all the fundamental objects of liberalism, and again we mean the classical variety, not the John Kerry, Obama sort of variety. All the fundamental objects of liberalism, free speech, unhampered enterprise, the least possible governmental interference, were abhorrent to him. And Mencken went on to say, in all his career, no one ever heard him make an argument for the rights of the citizen. His eloquence was always expended in expounding the duties of the citizen. Now, Theodore Roosevelt had, of course, quite a personality, unique in some ways among presidents. He was he was known for, as in later years, going on safaris and being a kind of a cowboy, a robust kind of man's man who willingly embraced the rigors of war, as he did during the Spanish-American War, who at times argued that peacetime, if it went on for too long, made individuals and nations grow flabby, that occasionally what was needed was a good war to encourage the martial virtues. Well, you can imagine how somebody with that type of personality, who wants to be at the center of everything, would grab hold of the presidential office and wring out of it everything he could, very much in line with the spirit of the progressive era. When Mark Twain had a chance to meet the president, he went away saying that this man is clearly insane. Roosevelt's own son said that father always wanted to be the bride at every wedding and the corpse at every funeral. Roosevelt at one point during the 1880s said that he was just exhausted, and so he just wanted to take a month off and do nothing but relax and write a biography of Oliver Cromwell. So he was an incredibly energetic person, and he brings this kind of energy, I might even say a kind of self-centeredness, to the execution of the duties of president. And he is going to expand the presidency. And in his autobiography/memoir that he publishes later, he recalls this with great pride, that I took the presidency and I made of it everything that there was to be made of it. And I built on precedents, and I expanded them, and I created new precedents. This isn't something that hostile scholars just make up. This is what he boasted of. He thought this was something, indeed, that the country needed. We could not cling to old-fashioned views of laissez-faire and modest presidents. We need big presidents with big visions and ideas and so on. So his philosophy of the presidency, you might say, ran as follows. Number one, the president is the unique representative of the American people, because the president is elected in an election that consists of all people in the country, whereas a U.S. senator is just voted for by people from that particular state. Nobody can lay claim to the kind of national mandate that a president can. And so the president is the unique representative of the American people. This was a new way of thinking. The president more or less may do whatever is not prohibited to him in the Constitution. It's not that he's got to limit himself to certain enumerated powers. He can more or less do whatever is not prohibited. And we also see Theodore Roosevelt kind of, we sometimes just refer to him by his initials, TR. We sometimes see him giving force to these ideas in his presidency through his use of what are known as executive orders. Executive orders are issued by the president with the intention of carrying out some function or ordering some government officials to do something. The point of them is that they are ways for the president to act on his own authority. Now, there are some ways in which executive orders can be entirely legitimate. There are ways in which they can be illegitimate, like if the president simply tries to pass a law by issuing an executive order and saying, now this is the law of the land, well, that would obviously be usurping the powers of Congress, because it is in the legislative branch where we see in the Constitution reposed the lawmaking power. So it would be an abuse of executive orders to use them for lawmaking purposes. However, it is legitimate to use, from a constitutional standpoint, executive orders to carry out clearly constitutional functions of government. So, for example, you could pardon people. The president has the power to pardon people, and you would carry that out by means of an executive order, things of that nature. But what's significant about Roosevelt is not just how he carried out his powers and how he used executive orders, but also the number of executive orders he issued. Because sometimes a quantitative measure, like the number of executive orders, can reveal a qualitative difference in the way somebody governs. So quantitative refers to the number of things. Qualitative refers to the kind. So because Theodore Roosevelt issues so many executive orders, this is an indication of the kind of presidency he envisions. So when we look at the decades leading up to Theodore Roosevelt's accession to the presidential office in 1901, we see presidents issuing maybe 3 executive orders or 0, or Cleveland, in one of his 2 non-consecutive terms, issued 70 executive orders, and McKinley was around 50. And then Theodore Roosevelt issues over 1,000. So that is very much a reflection of his view that he is the unique representative of the American people. And if he has to climb over obstructionists like U.S. senators or anybody else that are going to stand in the way of carrying out the will of the people, then that's exactly what he's going to do. And a great example of this comes from, is an example of how Roosevelt did this and used executive orders, follows from his Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. So let's first explain what that is, and then we're going to see an example of him implementing that shows how he used executive orders as a way of being able to circumvent the U.S. Senate. So the Monroe Doctrine, you'll recall from 1823, made clear that the U.S. government would not tolerate intervention by European powers in the Americas. The Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine says if it looks like such intervention is impending, because, for example, one of these countries has engaged in wrongdoing or isn't paying its debts or whatever, and there's a prospect that there will be European intervention, the United States will intervene first to forestall the European intervention. So this is a much more robust and vigorous approach to U.S. policy in the Americas than the original Monroe Doctrine. Well, here's how this has to do with the discussion of executive orders. The Dominican Republic had been having exactly this problem of difficulty or refusal to pay its debts, and there were European powers growing impatient with it. So in 1905, early 1905, Roosevelt reached an agreement with the Dominican Republic allowing the U.S. government to supervise its customs house and treasury and try to work out some type of repayment so that we could forestall this sort of intervention by outside powers. Now this agreement, this treaty, was to go into effect about 10 days after it had been drafted. So obviously not enough time for the Senate to have time to deliberate and decide on it. So clearly Roosevelt had intended to just force this agreement through without any input from the Senate at all. But the resulting outcry forced him to, in fact, bring it before the Senate. And then the Senate, in a special session, adjourned without taking action on it. So Roosevelt simply carried it out anyway. He simply called it an executive agreement, which we might call like the foreign policy analog of an executive order. And he simply carried it out on his own authority. And you may ask, well, can he do that? Well, is he allowed to do that? Well, the point is he did do it. And as time went on, eventually the Senate, after the fact, endorsed what Roosevelt had done. But Roosevelt said later in his memoirs that it didn't matter that they later agreed to what I had done. I would have kept on through it all through the rest of my term. I've got to set precedents for a vigorous presidency. So this is very much opposed to what we might say was the old conservative view that the presidency has to be kept in check in particular. It's a particularly dangerous branch. If you have to favor a branch, you favor the legislative branch because it's the closest to the people. The House is elected every 2 years. But now we see this emphasis on growing executive power. And we see that in some of the examples of how Roosevelt conducted himself in office. For example, the United Mine Workers strike in 1902. TR had ordered mine owners to submit to arbitration in the strike, and should they remain obstinate, he threatened to order the Army to take over the coal mines and operate them. He summoned General John Schofield and said to him this: "I bid you pay no heed to any other authority, no heed to writ from a judge, or anything else excepting my commands." Schofield was to stand ready to seize the mines and run them for the government. Well, that's an example of the way Roosevelt exercised his powers while president. The following year, the Panama Canal matter was very significant. First Nicaragua, but then Panama was thought to be a place that it would be useful to have to establish a canal. The reason is that Theodore Roosevelt wanted to see the U.S. government become a significant power abroad. He favored a large navy, and it would be highly impractical for that navy to have to get from the East Coast to the West Coast by going all the way around South America. It adds an extra 8,000 miles to the trip. Instead, we want to have an Isthmian canal that would make the trip much, much shorter. And so Panama was looked at as being a potential place for such a canal. But Panama was part of the country of Colombia at that time. And so an agreement was gradually hammered out with Colombia that the United States would have a perpetually renewable lease and Colombia would get $40 million. Well, the Colombian government more or less agreed to it, but was beginning to think that maybe the treaty was a bit too one-sided, but at the same time they certainly wanted the $40 million, and they were afraid that if they didn't take the deal, maybe TR would go the Nicaraguan route instead, so they were not quite sure what to do, but finally they reneged on the deal. The Colombian Senate refused to ratify it, which I suppose is not really reneging, that is their prerogative. And Theodore Roosevelt was absolutely outraged that instead of going back and figuring out some kind of mutually satisfactory arrangement, he just said, well, look, you just can't negotiate with these people. They're just unreasonable and impossible, and he basically thought not altogether civilized. And so what eventually was worked out was the secession of Panama from Colombia. The idea was that the United States would, in one way or another, assist the rebels in Panama that would be tearing Panama away from Colombia. And that once those rebels were independent of Colombia, well then in gratitude for the U.S. assistance, they would then turn around and allow the United States to go ahead with the canal project. So what in fact happened was that 10 U.S. Navy ships blocked Colombia's access to Panama because over land there was impenetrable jungle that the Colombian forces couldn't get to. There's no way they could go after the Panamanian rebels that way. They needed a sea route, and the sea routes were all blocked. And once this rebellion against the government of Colombia broke out, the U.S. government immediately recognized the rebels as constituting the sovereign government of the officially independent country of Panama. And that was done in 1903, and then the canal project went through. TR afterward more or less tried to justify what had gone on, and one cabinet member said, Mr. President, don't try to taint something as glorious as this with the taint of legality. But again, this is a kind of a much more, as you can see, a much more vigorous and activist kind of presidency. Roosevelt won the Nobel Peace Prize for helping to bring about peace between Russia and Japan following the Russo-Japanese War in 1905. So in large things and in small, Roosevelt was extremely activist. So even something as trivial as college football, when there were a lot of injuries in college football in the early 1900s, well, Roosevelt called a special conference with coaches and players to the White House to try to see what could be done. Now, this is the sort of thing that just would have been unthinkable to presidents in earlier years. They would have thought this is obviously an area where civil society ought to be allowed to function. But that was typical of TR, always grabbing opportunities to expand government power or to have people look more and more to government to solve problems that in the past they might have just looked to their own devices or common sense. The regulatory apparatus, as I say, begins to be formed under TR, and we see increasing regulation of the national economy. The Hepburn Act is passed in 1906, and the Hepburn Act requires federal government permission before the railroads can increase rail rates, and also restricts their ability to offer discounts to certain shippers. The Great Northern Railroad that stretched from St. Paul to Seattle had been giving discounts to agricultural shipments that were going to be shipped to the Asian powers from the Pacific Ocean, and this had helped some American farmers because now so you get a discount, you can ship your stuff if it's going to be for export. The Hepburn Act said, well, if you offer discounts to some people, you got to offer them to everybody. Well, Great Northern couldn't afford to offer them to everybody, so they just stopped offering them entirely, and agricultural exports to Japan and China fell off dramatically in the wake of that. But that's not usually included in the typical discussion of the Hepburn Act. And that, combined with the Mann-Elkins Act of 1910, under Roosevelt's successor, who had been his Secretary of War, William Howard Taft, the combination of those things devastated the profitability of the railroads, and the railroads more or less began to collapse in the second decade of the 20th century as a result of that. Roosevelt was known as a trust buster for busting up big companies. But as I'm showing in an article that I'm assigning you, this did not benefit the consumer. There was no evidence that any of the combinations he was interested in breaking up had actually harmed consumers, and to the contrary, they seem to have helped them. Also, William Howard Taft, his successor, deserves more the title of trust buster, because in his one term, he introduced about twice as many antitrust suits as Roosevelt had in his nearly 2 terms. But by the time Taft was in office, Roosevelt had moved away from the trust-busting philosophy that he'd once held, and now his view was that all the cool kids are now saying that instead of breaking up big companies, we keep them big but just regulate them. And so Taft is being kind of old-fashioned and sticking to what I was doing, 10 minutes ago, pretty much. So when we get to the election of 1912, who do we have here? We've got William Howard Taft, who later became, under Warren Harding, who was elected in 1920, he would become Chief Justice of the United States, the only person to be both President and Chief Justice. We have Taft, we have Woodrow Wilson, we have Theodore Roosevelt, and we have the socialist candidate Eugene V. Debs. Well, with the exception of Debs, very little separates these candidates. Very, very little. History textbooks, to the contrary, always portray this as a great watershed election, but that's typical, right? It's typical of the establishment to look at tiny little differences and make them out to be these huge differences. And I have my own theory as to why they pretend that little inconsequential differences are really big differences, and the American people really do have a big choice. But it's interesting, even Woodrow Wilson himself was honest enough to say in 1912 that he couldn't really tell the difference between his Democratic Party and the Republican Party, apart from, he said, the Republicans have more devotion to the tariff. But otherwise, I don't really see what the big difference is. I mean, Wilson was more interested in trust busting, and some of the Republicans were more interested in regulating the trusts. But I mean, this hardly seems like an unbridgeable chasm separating them. So that is just a brief kind of overview of the themes of the Progressive Era, of the principles that began to establish themselves front and center in American life, and I think a decent beginning of understanding the man who, more than any other, embodied the spirit and ideas of the Progressive Era, Theodore Roosevelt.